Today, we're diving deep into one of the most visible environmental challenges of our time, plastic pollution. But listen, this is way more than just trash on a beach. What we're really going to investigate is a massive, complex system failure, the story of how a material that was once a miracle became a global menace. Let's get right into it.
So here's our game plan for unpacking this whole thing. We're going to start with the truly shocking scale of the problem. Then, we'll dig into what makes plastic so uniquely dangerous. After that, we'll trace the history of how we got here, figure out who's responsible, and then, this is the important part, we'll explore the real options for solving this puzzle and building a circular future.
First things first, we have to get our heads around the sheer scale of this crisis. Because before we can even begin talking about solutions, you have to understand the numbers. And honestly, they are absolutely staggering.
Okay, get this. In 2019 alone, the world cranked out 460 million tons of plastic. But here's the real kicker. That number has doubled since just the year 2000. This isn't some problem that's been building for centuries. It's an explosion that's happened right in front of our eyes.
So where does all that plastic actually go? Well, this chart here tells a pretty grim story. Out of all the plastic waste, a full half of it just ends up buried in landfills. Another 22% is mismanaged, which is a nice way of saying it's dumped or just leaks directly into the environment. 19% gets burned, and that leaves that tiny little sliver for recycling.
9%. That's it. Let that sink in for a second. After all these decades of us carefully sorting our trash and putting it in the blue bin, only 9% of all plastic waste has ever been successfully recycled. This one number tells you everything you need to know. Our current system is just spectacularly broken. And that right there is the core problem we need to wrap our heads around.
But look, the issue isn't just the insane quantity of plastic. It's the very nature of the material itself. You see, the exact same things that make plastic so useful and amazing are precisely what make it so destructive when it becomes waste.
A huge part of the problem is that plastic never really goes away. It just breaks down into smaller and smaller and smaller pieces, which we call microplastics. These tiny bits are like ghosts in the system. They're in our water, in our food, even in the air we breathe, and they are nearly impossible to filter out. And that's exactly how they sneak into the food chain, starting with tiny plankton and working their way right up to us.
And when we say plastic sticks around, we really mean it. A single plastic bottle, something you might use for, 10 minutes, can take roughly 450 years to decompose. Think about that. That's a piece of trash that will outlive you, your kids, your grandkids, for maybe 15 generations.
So let's just pull these threads together. You've got extreme durability, so it basically never leaves. You've got harmful chemical additives that can leach out. You have a system totally dominated by single-use items. 40% of all plastic waste is just packaging. And then it inevitably breaks down into those microplastics that get everywhere. It's really a perfect storm of problematic features.
This all raises a huge question. Plastic has only been mass-produced for about 70 years. So how on earth did we get into a crisis of this magnitude this fast? To get that, we've got to look at the roots of the problem.
This timeline really puts it all into perspective. After it was invented, plastic was kind of a niche thing. The real turning point was the 1950s, when mass production collided with this new throwaway culture of convenience. But the real story, the part that is just mind-blowing, is what's called the Great Acceleration. Get this. More than half of all the plastic that has ever existed was made in just the last 2 decades.
Okay, so that timeline tells us when it all went wrong, but it doesn't really tell us why. What are the deep systemic failures that are driving this explosion? Well, the answer, as it often does, comes down to some very simple economics.
This right here, this gets to the absolute economic heart of the problem. On one side, you have brand new virgin plastic made from fossil fuels, and it is dirt cheap to produce. On the other side, you've got recycled plastic, which is more expensive to collect, sort, clean, and reprocess. And this creates a huge, powerful incentive that's really hard to overcome. It is almost always cheaper and easier for a company to make brand new plastic than to use recycled material. That one economic fact completely undermines our entire recycling system. So we've got a broken economic model. Now let's look at the different players inside that system and where the consequences of all this are hitting the hardest. Who's involved and who's really bearing the burden?
Responsibility here is really complicated, and it's shared. You've got the producers, the big corporations making the plastic and the products.
You have governments who have the power to set the rules of the game. You've got us, the consumers, because our choices create the demand. And then you have the waste management sector, and that includes not just city services, but also a huge informal army of waste pickers who are, in many parts of the world, the real backbone of recycling.
The failure of this whole system is most obvious when you look at our oceans. An estimated 11 million tons of plastic floods into the seas every single year. Now, to try and picture that, imagine a garbage truck completely full of plastic backing up to the ocean and dumping its load every single minute of every single day. And the worst part is, without some serious action, that number is expected to triple by 2040.
So how is all that plastic even getting to the ocean? The answer is primarily rivers. You can think of them as superhighways, carrying all the mismanaged waste from deep inland straight out to the sea. And in fact, research shows that a surprisingly small number of major rivers are the main culprits, turning what starts as a local waste problem into a truly global ocean crisis.
Let's look at India as a real-world example of this. It's one of the top generators of plastic waste, but it has also passed some really ambitious laws, like banning certain single-use plastics and creating what's called extended producer responsibility. That's a policy that makes companies financially responsible for dealing with the waste their products create. But the challenges on the ground are massive. Enforcement can be weak, and pollution still chokes major rivers like the Ganga. It's a classic case of good intentions running into a very complex reality.
Okay, so we've diagnosed the scale, the causes, and the key players in this crisis. Now we need to pivot to the most important part of this whole discussion. How do we actually solve this puzzle? Let's start evaluating the options on the table.
We have to start by coming back to that 9% number again. I mean, if recycling, the main solution we've all been taught for decades, is failing 91% of the time, then we have to ask a much harder question. What actually works? It's time to start looking beyond the blue bin.
This table basically lays out our options in what's called the waste hierarchy. At the very bottom, the worst option is landfill. You're just burying the problem. A step up is incineration, but that creates its own set of pollution problems. Then you have recycling, which is great in theory, but as we've seen, really struggles in practice. And way up at the top, the single most effective strategy by far is to reduce and reuse. And why is it the best? Because it's the only one that actually stops the waste from ever being created in the first place.
This gives us a really powerful way to think about this. Upstream versus downstream solutions. Downstream is everything we do after the waste has already been created. Better collection, more recycling. And that's important, but it's basically like trying to mop up the floor while your sink is overflowing. Upstream solutions are about trying to turn off the tap. This means things like capping the production of new plastic and completely redesigning products so they can be reused. So the real question is, do we want to just get better at mopping, or do we want to fix the leak?
And that idea of turning off the tap brings us to our final section. Because the ultimate answer here isn't just one single action, it's a complete shift in how we think. We need to forge a totally new paradigm, a truly circular future for plastic.
So what does a circular economy actually look like? Well, it boils down to three core ideas. First, you design waste and pollution out of the system from the very beginning. Second, you do everything you can to keep products and materials in use for as long as possible, always prioritizing reuse over recycling. And third, you make sure the materials are returned safely to the economy, not leaked into the environment. It's the exact opposite of our current take, make, dispose model.
Now, a systemic problem this big demands a systemic, global solution. And that's why maybe the most important thing happening right now is the negotiation of a legally binding UN Global Plastic Treaty. Plastic pollution doesn't care about borders, so this is a really historic opportunity to create one unified set of rules, set clear global targets, and hold every nation and every corporation to the same standard. Ultimately, the path forward is clear, even if it's going to be really challenging. As the source material puts it, a bold, coordinated, and global effort is the only way to mitigate the enduring damage of plastic. The simple truth is, this problem was created by a system that we designed, and the only way out is for us to have the courage to redesign it. Thanks for tuning in.